Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Nat Cohan, and I'm the president of the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, or C2ES. For those of you new to C2ES, we are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to secure a safe and stable climate by accelerating the transition to a thriving, just, and resilient net zero economy. And it's a pleasure to welcome you today to the Pricing Carbon Initiative's public forum on American views on climate and trade policy, polling insights, and policy implications. I'm particularly pleased to be hosting this public forum because linking climate and trade policies has emerged as a promising opportunity to lower emissions in the United States while simultaneously spurring other countries, in particular emerging economies, to strengthen their own policies. Addressing the competitiveness impacts of climate policies is something that C2ES has examined and written about over our 25-year history. And later this month, we'll be launching a new initiative working with leading companies in our business council to identify and advance climate-aligned trade policies. C2ES has also been an active participant and a steering committee member of the Pricing Carbon Initiative. PCI provides a forum to foster dialogue across the political spectrum on viable solutions to address climate change. Today's public forum features a presentation on first-of-its-kind polling data on public attitudes toward climate-oriented trade policies. Over the last several years, there's been growing interest on both sides of the political aisle to address economic competitiveness concerns by pairing policies to cut US industrial emissions with trade measures such as tariffs on carbon-intensive imports. Recent studies indicate US manufacturers are able to produce the same goods with a lower overall carbon intensity than many other countries, giving the United States a clear carbon advantage. Moreover, closing this carbon loophole, whereby countries reduce their own emissions while importing goods from countries that emit more, closing that loophole represents a significant opportunity to reduce global emissions. That's because emissions embodied in globally traded goods made up nearly a quarter of global carbon dioxide emissions in 2019. Imports to the United States alone represented about a fifth of US greenhouse gas emissions in 2019. Against this backdrop, there have been several border carbon fee proposals so far in this Congress. There's been the formation of the White House Climate and Trade Task Force in April 2024, and there's been growing bipartisan support for and public interest in this policy topic. So surveying public opinion on climate and trade policy is important, but it's relatively new, and it could influence how legislators think about designing climate and trade policies. And that's where this conversation will kick off. Before we begin, I'd like to cover a couple of housekeeping policies or housekeeping items. First, we will be recording this webinar. A recording of the webinar will be made available on the C2ES YouTube webpage within 24 hours. Second, closed captions have been enabled for this webinar. To turn on closed captioning, click the button at the bottom of your screen. Lastly, the format of today's webinar will be a presentation followed by a panel discussion. Christopher Borick, director of the Muhlenberg College Institute of Public Opinion, will unveil new polling data on public attitudes towards climate-oriented trade policy. Following Christopher's presentation, Barry Rabe, the Harris Family Chair of Public Policy at the Gerald Ford School of Public Policy at the University of Michigan, will moderate a panel with C2ES's Vice President for International Strategies, Kaveh Galanpour, Young Kwan, Senior Campaign Advisor for Industrial Transformation at the Sierra Club, and Shuting Pomerleau, Deputy Director of Climate Policy at the Niskanen Center. We'll have some time at the end for audience Q&A and the discussion, so please submit your questions into the Q&A portion of Zoom, and we'll do our best to answer them. With that, let me turn things over to Danny Richter from PCI to introduce Christopher. Danny?
Thanks, Nat, and thanks to you and your team for your help in putting this on. My name is Danny Richter, one of the co-directors of the Pricing Carbon Initiative. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for being here. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Christopher Borick, who is a professor of political science and the director of the Muhlenberg College Institute of Public Opinion. He runs the National Surveys on the Energy and the Environment, or NSEE, a survey series dating back to 2008 under a partnership between Muhlenberg College and the University of Michigan. Beginning in 2020, the NSEE has been produced exclusively by the Muhlenberg College Institute of Public Opinion. Chris, the floor is yours.
Great, Danny. Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you for putting together this event. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to provide some insight into the broader dimensions that Nat laid out really nicely at the beginning of the discussion. So I'm going to share my screen right now, and get that, and I think we'll be ready to go. So yes, a little bit of background, a little bit of context as we move forward. So for decades, we've studied, along with a lot of other researchers in the United States, public opinion on a variety of different carbon pricing mechanisms, from carbon taxes to cap and trade. And generally, what has been seen is modest to low support for these various tools. Sometimes you could adjust those. You put things like dividends into the mix. Of course, you might be able to get some upward movement in public support, but largely they've never gained incredible traction among the American public. It's also an area, like many areas of climate beliefs and attitudes, where deep partisan divides exist in terms of public support for a variety of those mechanisms. So enter, as we discussed today, carbon border adjustments. And we've seen the rise, as discussed previously, in the prominence of these tools, with numerous proposed bills in Congress that do span political parties. Now, there's differences in terms that I'm sure we'll get into in the discussion after. Nonetheless, it seems that they've had a rise in prominence within the climate policy debates. And it's important to note that these bills are being considered as both major party presidential candidates have supported some forms of expanded or intensified tariffs. The commonality between Harris and Trump campaigns is often the citing of unfair trade factors as a key reason for their support. So while they may have differing views, they share some common reasoning behind those support for different types of tariffs. So as I write on this slide, with tariffs having a moment, if you will, in American politics, it's interesting to think about where the American public is on this particular matter, and where the nexus might be between climate policy and tariff-oriented tools. And thus, this year, in our latest wave, as Danny said, we've been doing our climate surveys all the way dating back to 2008, when Barry and I started to put together the NSEE. This year, we wanted to have at least one battery of survey items that focused on this particular realm of climate policy that seems to be increasing in terms of relevance and discussions. And so what I'm going to do today is walk us through some of the results that have been drawn from our survey, which is a probability-based survey of 715 Americans that we did in June and July. Happy to share with folks the methods, much more detailed description of the methods to make sure we have full transparency there. But just to set up, this is where the results will come from. All right, I'm going to start with the first aspect of our findings. We wanted to get a sense of if Americans see the U.S. as being well positioned in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions in manufacturing related to other countries. So we did three frames in the survey. We asked if they thought that goods manufactured in the United States produce more or less or about the same greenhouse gas emissions as most other countries, kind of broadly defined, more narrowly defined with European countries, and of course, juxtaposed against China. And as you can see from the chart that I have posted, largely across the three frames, Americans see the United States as fairly well positioned on this issue. 61% think that the U.S. produces less greenhouse gases than most other countries, drops to 43% in relation to European countries, and at its highest peak, in relation to China, where 2/3 of Americans think that goods manufactured here are less greenhouse emitting. When we turn to, as I'll show in the next slide, how this overlays with partisanship. Again, partisanship is an absolute defining feature of public attitudes and beliefs for climate policy, climate acceptance of the underlying problem, an array of factors. As you'll see here, and this is one of the defining aspects, I think, of the research that I'll be interested to hear during the discussion, is that you see a majority of Americans across partisan divides, Democrat, Republican, and Independent, who think the United States, in relation to most other countries, produces less greenhouse gases during our manufacturing processes. It is highest among Republicans, something I think we'll want to chat about later. It's an interesting finding, but you could see fairly consistent a belief that the United States is well positioned in relation to other countries. When we look at it in relation to European countries, the Democrats become a little more divided in how they view this, as do independents. Republicans also are less likely to think the U.S. is well positioned, but still a strong majority of Republicans end up in that point in terms of European. The next slide is China, which I think is one of the interesting takeaways when we ask on this particular relationship comparison between the U.S. and China. You see incredible consistency across Democrats, Republicans, and independents in terms of China's manufacturing output of emissions, greenhouse emissions in relation to the U.S. I'll come back to this a little bit later, but I think that finding's pretty interesting for a number of reasons. And then we get to the next stage of the battery that we looked at in terms of carbon border issues is a series of agreement statements with some policy relevance in terms of the topic. You'll see 3 pie charts here. We gave 3 frames to the respondents in this year's waves. We asked them the level of agreement: strongly agree, somewhat disagree, strongly disagree, with 3 statements. The first, as you'll see, it is important that the United States follow international trade agreements, kind of broad acceptance of the importance of trade agreements. The second gets more specific in terms of carbon border adjustment structures. It says the U.S. should place a tariff on goods manufactured in other countries that are produced with more greenhouse gas emissions than the U.S., even if it raises the cost of buying those goods in the U.S., a key factor in the framing that we want to stress. And then finally, we asked if, when negotiating a trade agreement with other countries, the United States should prioritize the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. As you can see from the pie charts, hopefully, the blue is strongly agree. And so across the 3 frames, you have largely about a third or a little bit more than a third of Americans agreeing with the premise on all 3 of those statements. But you expand that in the orange, which is the somewhat agree, and you can see majorities of Americans for each of these 3 frames that we posited support or agree with the conditions. Again, largely conditions that I think are very much related to carbon border adjustments and the types of approaches that might be taken. What I'll do in the remaining last few minutes here is to look at how these things play out across traditionally or important demographic divides and socio-political divides. We start with party, and we look at the relationship in terms of importance for the U.S. in following international trade agreements, just on the big premise. And once again, you could see the blue and the orange are either strongly or somewhat agree. Some degrees differences in intensity of agreement between Republicans, Democrats, and independents, with Democrats more likely to strongly agree. But strong majorities of each of these groups, each of the cohorts, in agreement with the overall premise that we've seen. You also can see a couple of quick runs through on demographic factors. It generally is fairly consistent across age or demographic cohorts. Drops a little bit in that 45 to 64 group, which we actually, it's a very interesting group to look at in a number of climate related matters. But again, in terms of majority agreement across those demographic divides, One incredibly important and salient divide that's increasing in the United States in almost all policy areas or significant policy areas is educational attainment. As you could see in terms of this this particular item, the differences between those without a college degree and those with a college degree are fairly modest. Those with a college degree are a little bit more likely to strongly agree. But again, not dramatic differences. One of the big takeaways that I see across the divides. We move to the frame that's more directly tied to the policy tools being used here, putting a tariff, even if it raises the cost. And you can see that across the partisan divides, and again, a factor that pops in terms of difference usually in almost any climate policy or attitudes and beliefs questions we ask, it's simply not as present in this case, with the majority either agreeing strongly or somewhat agreeing with the statement. Noticed among Republicans that it's roughly 2/3 of Republicans that we interviewed that are in that position. I think a key takeaway that we could talk about. I just wanted to roll in one more on educational attainment in that strikingly similar results in an era where this particular demographic factor is robust in terms of differences that we see in the U.S. population. The final run is with the question when negotiating a trade agreement with other countries, the United States should prioritize the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. See a little bit more difference here with Democrats more likely to indicate that a strong agreement than either Republicans or independents. But once again, you get even majority agreement on that premise, and you see the similar or very similar results in terms of educational attainment on that matter. All right, so wrapping up the survey findings. I think the big takeaways I have are Americans generally believe that the United States has an advantage in terms of greenhouse gas emissions produced by manufacturing of goods. And the United States residents we survey largely support policy tools, in this case, the tariff that we looked at, on goods produced abroad that are manufactured with more greenhouse gas emissions than goods produced in the United States. It was fairly consistent. And support for tariffs related to greenhouse gas emissions transcends the partisan divides that often predict support for other carbon pricing mechanisms. That last point, I think, can't be reinforced enough. Now, are the factors that lead Republicans and Democrats to conclude that they support this the same? Most likely not. In future surveys, our next wave will probably explore that in much greater detail. In many ways, could be that it's akin to a concurring opinion right now that Democrats and Republicans arrive at this conclusion for different reasons, but nonetheless do arrive at that conclusion, and perhaps opening up a door, as Nat described in his opening frame, for some movement on this matter. So with that, I'm going to stop my share and turn it back over to Danny.
Well, don't go anywhere, Chris, because I have some questions for you. First of all, let me just say thank you again for doing this. This whole process has been so much fun. I mean, you reached out to us, and I had never done this before, come up with questions and workshop them to the point where you can actually do a survey on them. And so I'll leave the results to the discussants. I'll just say that my mouth just about hit the floor when I saw the results, and I'll stick to process here. And my first question for you, running a long-term survey, why was there space for these questions? With a long-running survey, how do you make decisions about what questions stay or when it's time to add new ones?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question, Danny. And you know, from the many waves that we've done over the years, all dating back to 2008, there are, of course, question items that we ask every single time. Our standard beliefs questions, our attitude questions that we put in the surveys. They never change. There are other questions that we revisit from time to time, maybe policy questions to see if there's movement in the American electorate. We add new questions in on emerging topics from the field and from the policy a realm. So this changes, of course, some questions over time. For this particular cycle, I'll give you and the folks at PCI credit. I've been lucky enough to be in a number of the dialogues over the years and have presented. And as we went into this year's cycle and we started to look at content, it struck me that this is one area of climate policy that, of course, has promise given the types of bills that I'm sure we'll talk about today, and that might have opportunities to transcend again some of those partisan divides that are so prominent within the field. So once we got to the point of developing this year's instrument and getting to that, I was a pleasure to reach out to you and other folks in this broader discussion and get some feedback and therefore build out that component. Again, each year it's kind of a fight for what gets in and what doesn't get in. I wanted to make sure that got in this year. I think it was particularly relevant that we did.
Well, we appreciate you putting it in. Very interesting for our work, and those of so many of our network. Second question is that this is a pretty technical topic. So how do you balance the need to convey complex topics with comprehension for a random person you call when developing these new questions?
Yeah, it's an amazingly challenging aspect of an amazing, what I would describe as an amazingly challenging field, measuring public attitudes and all the methodological hurdles that must be gotten over. And this is one of those: wording, items. How do we do it? And it's of course dictated in many ways by the types of methods we use. This is a telephone, primarily cell phone survey. So how we word for that type of medium versus a web-based survey, of course, we'll have to adapt to that in terms of the length of the question, the types of frames. And so in this type, we do have to keep it fairly basic. So what you have to do is try and create frames that are attainable in a short term, that might not be overly complex, but do transmit the core underlying factors that might be engaged or involved in a policy area, for example, or a broad field like trade policy. And then you of course have to pretest, see for how individuals are responding to it in a pretest format, as it seemed like they're able to attain it, and then you eventually come up with a form that you want to try. That might be changed, by the way. Yeah, I'm already interested in revisiting these questions after the election to see what kind of effects that we often see elections have, intervening in terms of public attitudes to these matters. But also, as I finish this round, and I think I noted in the discussion, it raises more questions, right? As I ended on possibly the factors that might lead to Republicans and Democrats to agree on this. I suspect it probably comes from different sources of interest, and in the next wave, getting at those would be a key moving forward.
Well, keep us along for the ride. We're there. We'd love to see it. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Barry, but Chris will be available for the discussion with the discussants. So thank you again, Chris. Barry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Danny. Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everyone. I really welcome this conversation. I think all of us have been interested in this growing question of the intersection between climate and trade policies. In some ways, we might have anticipated for some time, but in other instances, with lots of new nuances and twists and uncertainties. I have been struck as I survey what we know about these issues, including things like border adjustments. It's an area where most of the heavy lifting so far has been done by either the discipline of economics or in the arena of law. If you look at peer-reviewed publications, journal articles, academic work in this space, it's almost all involving economics and law. Great contribution, but very little on economics. Also contributions that are coming in more applied fields, including think tanks. So I think we actually are beginning to know a fair economics of CBAM and other kinds of issues and legal aspects, compliance issues. But what about political feasibility? Much what does the public know and think? And so what I think Chris has provided here is an initial snapshot. We've not seen much survey work on this in the United States, or from what I've been able to see globally. and how we might begin to kind of weigh and think about that. And so I'm really delighted to welcome in our other three colleagues participating today, and would ask them to join at this point, and would ask each of them to things a little bit differently from each one. And by the way, Chris, Danny told you not to go away. Please don't go away, because we might bring you back into this conversation and respond to what you're going to be hearing for these folks. And so, Kavya, I'd really like to start with you, in part because you've worked so intensively in the European Union, in the United Kingdom, which is sort of the home of really beginning to think about not only a sustained approach to carbon pricing domestically, but also these issues of CBAM taking real form. And if you could help us get started here by just putting in play the current state of play in the European Union and the United Kingdom on these issues, but then share any reactions that you might have to what you've just heard and seen for us, this effort to take a look at public opinion in an American context. Any thoughts you'd like to share?
Well, thanks, Barry, and thanks for inviting me. I have to say, I'm really struck by the findings of the report that Chris shared earlier. I was in the EU at the time when the EU was trying to bring in the aviation sector into the emissions trading scheme some years back. And at the time, there was significant pushback from both the G7 countries, but also the emerging economies. Now, I'm not a trade negotiator. I'm a climate negotiator. I've been involved in the UNFCCC negotiations for almost 20 years or so now. And the pushback at the time to that was overwhelming and also very heartfelt. What I find different this time is quite striking. And I think it's interesting what Chris said in terms of the survey results, that across the divide, people come to the same answer from different perspectives and maybe from different reasons. And I think that's fine. And I have a sense that there's a potential alignment of stars here that would allow the European Union CBAM to be used in a positive way. So, I mean, let me just talk through that a little bit. At the moment, I don't feel that there's as much pushback internationally to the EU CBAM as there was last time around with aviation. There's some rhetoric around it, but there's just not that sort of heartfelt pushback. And I think there's an acceptance that this is happening. It's been legislated. It's being transitioned to be fully operational within the next year or so. So I think that's different. I think the survey results also show very positively that an overwhelming percentage of Americans are in favor of multilateralism and also to take some action in this space, which I think is also very positive. And the third element I think that Chris raised is that the two presidential candidates who are going to be debating later today, let's hear if they say anything about climate change, do have some common ground on the aspects of trade and maybe having some sort of border adjustments in relation to this issue, maybe from very different perspectives. But if they end up in the same place, then that's positive. What's happened in the last year in the international negotiations is that we've had the first global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. So this is a mechanism where every 5 years countries come together, see where they are against the goals of the Paris Agreement, such as reducing emissions so that we don't overstep the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit, and to inform the next round of ambition of climate targets, which are due in February of next year. COP28 also set a number of targets to be achieved by 2030, such as transitioning away from fossil fuels, tripling renewable energy, doubling energy efficiency. But one of the aspects of the global stocktake that's often overlooked is the mandate to enhance international cooperation. And I think this sort of alignment of stars that we're seeing potentially around this issue, I mean, it's very controversial and it would take a lot of work. But if we could use the concept of border adjustments, not as a sort of perceived protectionism, but as a tool to accelerate cooperation between countries to ensure that the adjustments never actually come into effect, then I think this could be a very useful policy tool. And I think it's very positive that the United States and the EU and other developed countries are speaking to each other actively to have policies so that there is a level competitive playing field across these sectors. It would be good to see that conversation extended more intensively to the emerging economies to bring that conversation to China, to India and others. But I think from what I'm seeing at the moment, there's a lot of positive potential, and that the EU CBAM is beginning to have that positive impact on not only domestic policy, but also on shaping policy abroad to make sure that we all pull together to achieve this goal. The one thing I would say about the survey results that may be a positive for the US, but I would question the reality of it, is I think there's an over sort of positive perspective on how the US is performing in terms of its carbon intensity, at least against developed nations. I'm pretty sure that the US's carbon intensity is higher for equivalent products than the EU, for example. But that sort of positivity bias is only helpful from the US policy maker's perspective. So I don't know. I think that I'd like to see the positive side of this. And I think this is an area where there is some overlap between the two presidential candidates. And I think that should be exploited, because we need to pull together whenever we can. So back to you, Barry. Have we lost Barry? Maybe Chris, back to you.
Yeah, so sorry, or Danny. I think maybe Barry's having some technical issues. It seemed that way. So I'll take unless Danny has a suggestion. Maybe we'll go to Shuting for some opening statements. Is that fine, Shuting?
Yes, absolutely. Oh, we just have Barry back. Oh, I was called upon, so I will jump right in. First of all, I would like to say thank you very much to Chris for doing this awesome survey, the polling results. I really look forward to reading the study when it's released later this month, and congratulations on this pilot initiative. And then I want to say thank you to C2ES and PCI for putting together this very insightful webinar. A couple of points. I look forward to more in-depth discussion later in the panel, but I have 4 quick points I would like to summarize. These are my quick observations from Chris's presentation on the polling results. The very first one I would like to highlight is it's striking that regardless of demographics, party liaison, a majority of Americans think it's important to follow international trade agreements for the United States. I was very happy when I saw the results. In Washington and also in the policy circle, there has been a narrative that's saying that there's a urgent need for addressing climate change. Therefore, we don't really have to worry about the World Trade Organization. World trade rules don't really matter. But based on the polling results, and also what I've been advocating for at the Niskanen Center, that it's imperative to follow the international trade rules, especially the World Trade Organization's rules for economic reasons. WTO has contributed a lot of growth into the global economic growth, as well as the economic growth in the US. Geopolitically, I echo what Kaveh said. It's very important that if the US is implementing any sort of climate and trade policies, it's not being perceived that it's a protectionist policies. A lot of critics like to point to, oh, but the WTO's appellate body is not functioning, can no longer arbitrate on cases. I would actually argue that it's all the more important for the US to follow the World Trade rules, because the WTO has never really been in the role of a world police. The countries still had the sovereignty to not follow the WTO rules, as long as they are okay with the consequences of not following the rules. So that's the first observation. I believe more than 80% of Americans believe that it's very important for the country to follow international trade agreements. Second, I would like to point out very interesting polling results here that it's a little bit interesting, surprising to me that a majority of the surveyed targets, they said that they are willing to accept the consequence of raised costs of goods in the United States if the US were to put a tariffs on imported goods. That's fascinating to me. I think there's a lot to unpack. If Chris, you're doing a follow-up polling in the future, I would love to talk more about this. I think it would be really interesting to get down to, you know, which goods are they more likely or less likely to pay more, and how much more? How much more are we talking about? Are we talking about 50% more? Or are we talking about 5% more? Third point, quickly, I think this is also a very fascinating point that it's worth unpacking in maybe in your upcoming study or any follow-up polling is in the very last slide you highlighted, Chris, that the support for tariffs related to greenhouse gas seems to have transcended the partisan divides that predict support for carbon pricing mechanisms. I think the question is, are you supportive of the US to put tariffs on imported goods for emissions reduction reason? And then what I've seen from the polling results is an overwhelming yes. But I think it would be really interesting to unfold that and see, well, how about for job reasons or for national security reasons? Is the support comes from generally just tariffs? People, for some reason, love tariffs, very enthusiastic about tariffs, at least some people in the US, or is it specifically related to greenhouse gas emissions? My guess is it's really happening, right? Like as Kaveh just said, that the US has several legislative proposals on greenhouse gas emissions, green tariffs, carbon border adjustment, whatever you name it. It is a trend, and I think a lot of people acknowledge both publicly and privately that this is going to be happening. But as Democrats and Republicans seem to kind of converge on the policy tool of really being in favor of tariffs, I think this would be a very interesting point to look further into. My very last point is I absolutely agree with what Kaveh just said, that there's more nuance about the relative carbon intensity of industries of the US compared to other major economies. It is true the US is much less carbon intensive than other developing countries like China, India, and Russia. And based on the Niskanen Center's research, I had a research paper published last year that the US is actually, it has a lot of room to improve in terms of industrial carbon intensity compared to some developed economies. With that, I'll turn it back to Barry, and thank you for having me.
Thank you. I want to assure you I was not taking a coffee break. My computer simply froze. Chris, my understanding is you jumped in very ably and moved things along. Thank you. So thanks for comments. Young, I'd also like to turn now to you. You've worked in a different context extensively, particularly in South Korea, but more broadly Asia, where there's, I know, a great deal of interest to what is going on in Europe and other places. But can you do the same thing? Can you begin to stage set from that part of the world? And with it, any reaction you might have to what you've just heard from Chris, or for that matter, the two colleagues who preceded you in conversation.
Thank you, Barry, and thank you, co-panelists, for your comments. And congratulations on completing the survey. I work for the Sierra Club, an environmental organization committed to addressing the ongoing climate crisis and ensuring a just transition that includes protecting public health and conserving our natural spaces. So if you don't mind, I thought maybe perhaps I will address some of the survey results from the perspective of the domestic environment and some of the engagements I've had in my capacity as a Sierra Club employee. The polling results, specifically the overwhelming support for a carbon border adjustment, is quite consistent with what the Sierra Club has observed qualitatively among our diverse group of volunteers and members across the country. The survey and our experience with Sierra Club members suggest that the theory of change that the carbon border adjustment promises is quite intuitive to many people. And at the very least, from the Sierra Club's perspective, the theory shared amongst our members goes something like this. We're at the cusp of adopting technologies that can produce materials with much lower emissions, but the adoption of these technologies, which will have large upfront costs, could be undercut or discouraged by the imports that are made from more polluting industrial processes that do not require immediate investments. So this has the consequence of not only exacerbating the climate crisis, but also preventing our own industrial sector from evolving into a cleaner production pathway with fewer greenhouse gas emissions and fewer toxic co-pollution that accompany the combustion of fossil fuel-based byproducts. So a carbon border adjustment could equalize the playing field for innovative actors that are making upfront investments for the common good. This will have an effect on reducing climate emissions. In addition, this will have dividends in domestic jobs as new facilities are built and maintained, and in public health as these new technologies carry fewer co-pollutant risks, they'll have public health benefits as well. So the polling results overall reaffirm what we have learned from our members as well. So it's very good to see our experiences affirmed through some of these numbers that have been presented earlier. I think the sticky question, as many of my co-panelists have already addressed, is how do we contend with executing this in a manner that is practical, effective, and conforming with international norms, which the polling also confirms a majority of Americans care deeply about. I think one solution here that addresses all these challenges is through the adoption of a carbon price applied to both domestic industries and international actors importing to the United States. A big hurdle is making sure that whatever mechanism we have at the border that blocks irresponsible importers to the United States do not turn into a shield for irresponsible actors at home in the United States. This is obviously a problem of fairness and international rules, as Shuting mentioned, but also a question of effectiveness in tackling the climate crisis. So I take great interest in the polling results here because it also, I think, serves as proxy for the general public's acknowledgement of the climate change crisis. And the fact that the public supports such a measure, even at the cost of higher domestic prices, as Shuting highlighted, shows, I think, perhaps the acknowledgement of the urgency of the climate change mitigation. But I would love to see that perhaps connection that I see perhaps affirmed in future studies. Two additional observations that I'd like to present to my co-panelists and audiences today is, first, I saw the variation between Democratic and Republican voters regarding their belief on whether US industries emit more greenhouse gases vis-a-vis European or Chinese counterparts. And I think one might expect Republican respondents to overestimate the climate advantage of the United States. But I wonder if the poll actually reflects local realities. And what I mean by that is heavy industries do tend to be located in Republican states. And some sectors of the United States do have a climate advantage vis-a-vis international competitors. As Shuting mentioned, there are certainly many that do have disadvantages, but there are many with advantages. So I'm curious if the polling shows not necessarily a political bias, but perhaps a regional reality of the local industry's pollution profile. I'm curious to hear more thoughts on this. Second, I was surprised to see that more Republican respondents believe that European industries emit more greenhouse gases than the United States, than there are Republican respondents who believe that Chinese industries emit more than US counterparts. This is interesting to me because so much of our political discourse, particularly in bipartisan discussions, takes place in the context of focusing on China as the greatest risk to mitigating climate change. And I'm curious to learn whether this observation ought to affect how we think about crafting the policies that would sustain a political coalition to advance the carbon border adjustment in the United States. With that, I will pass the mic back to my co-panelists and look forward to a discussion. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that. Had one or two more questions. Chris, I want to turn to you next and allow you to respond. I also want to remind that we are leaving a little bit of time at the end for participant or for audience questions. And so if you would enter those, and we'll take a look at them and try to get to those in our remaining time. Chris, I just wanted to invite you, having heard three initial comments and reactions, if there are any comments that you would like to make, and I'd like to just put two pieces out there real quickly. One is, Yang raised the issue of regional variation and where industry concentration is. And I wonder if you can methodologically talk a little bit about your sample, not getting too deeply into the weeds, but sort of what you have been able to find. And secondly, embedded in a lot of this discussion is the idea of some kind of a price related to carbon more generally, beginning with what we see in the European Union. And I didn't really have much time earlier to talk about the much more extensive research agenda you've pursued on all kinds of ways for Americans to think about carbon pricing, revenue use, structure. And so is there anything there that you'd want to kind of, while responding to comments, sort of bring as part of the discussion, realizing that we're in carbon border territory, it's a somewhat different beast, and yet you have a lot of more experience dealing with the internal domestic side of pricing.
Yeah, thank you so much, Barry and Kaveh and Shooting and Young. Wonderful thoughts, and you all have great context for where these findings fit or may need additional data points. And now, one thing that I would kind of taking from your thoughts is the arrival. Again, I use the analogy of a concurring opinion between Republicans and Democrats as they arrive. Right, we see this within broader American politics, where you have Harris and Trump talking about tariffs in differing degrees and for differing reasons and under differing conditions. And so when Republicans, for example, in our survey, and this is to all your points, we need to really dig deeper to perhaps see the reasoning behind and the factors that might align with this. But ultimately, if for example, Republicans think that Europeans are not as they're producing less clean than us, less greenhouse gas or more greenhouse gas emissions than in the U.S., it possibly reflects kind of just a U.S. bias, right? A general U.S. bias that we do it better. That might be more concentrated in Republicans. You see, when you compare that to Democrats, they tend to move more compared to general countries when you frame it with Europe, which leads to lots of these factors that might get us to some places. In the end, when we frame, and it might be surprising to think that, hey, when we frame to something with climate, that Republicans would be so likely and similar to Democrats to support the measure, it might not be that they're seeing the lead is the climate aspect of this. The lead is the fairness aspect in their minds. The idea that the U.S. is getting a bad deal and this is a chance. It happens to be through the mechanism of climate that we're getting there. And that's why they like it, not because particularly, I would like to think that they care particularly about climate, but there might be some other evidence. In fact, we could really piece that out through the data that Barry references. But I think that's in the end, they get there together. Why is something we really want to build out. Barry, you asked, and this follows nicely off of Young. We you know what, we simply haven't yet really. We have it all geocoded by zip codes. We could overlay that very easily with kind of carbon intensive industries in those places and do a test for that. That sounds like a really, really good project moving down the road. There's lots of other, we have, the survey itself has, the 30 other items based on beliefs, attitudes, support, views on, and we haven't yet really fully looked at those. We kind of just ran with the demographics at this point.
Great, thank you. Kaveh, Shooting, and Young, I'd invite you to offer one piece of reflection here. You've heard a nice early chunk of survey research, a one-time initial experiment in a national context where my guess is the vast majority of Americans have never heard about or thought about carbon border adjustment mechanisms. They're beginning to hear the word tariff and trade a lot, probably quite a bit later on this evening. Would there be any advice you would have for Chris or others who are working in this space, what are the really crucial questions that from your perspective need to be raised as we begin to think about the future of carbon border adjustments, both domestically in multiple contexts, but internationally? What questions really need to be beyond the ones that Chris has put forth today that really need to be explored in some way and could theoretically be done on a much, much broader scale? Anyone care to jump in on that? Kaveh, please.
Thanks a lot, Barry. And I forgot to sort of congratulate Chris and others who worked on this survey from the outset, so I'll do that now. I mean, to answer your question, I would just say I think we just need more of this kind of work. I noticed a question in the Q&A from Stephen Hudson, who sort of noted that there's sort of this positive trend in the survey towards carbon pricing on imports, and yet some pushback in the EU and other jurisdictions which are actually putting these things in place. I think what we're finding, particularly in developed countries, but I think in all countries, as we get closer towards achieving net zero emissions, there will be increasing pushback because the low-hanging fruit will have disappeared, and it will be increasingly difficult to demonstrate a just and fair transition that takes everyone with them. So I think the sort of results in this survey that show that there's different starting points, but the same endpoints. So for different political reasons, people on different sides of the political aisle might arrive at the same place. I think more of this kind of work and communication as to the benefits and co-benefits of policies, not just climate, I think is absolutely vital, because we are going to see increasing pushback everywhere as we get closer towards achieving net zero. So I think more of this work to inform policy making is really vital. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Shooting, please.
Yes, that's an excellent question, Barry. I would pick one thing I would like Chris to work on if you have time and resources going forward. I would like you to work on many things, but I'll narrow it down to one thing. I think it will be very interesting to ask the respondents whether they think this so-called carbon pricing on imported goods needs to be paired with a domestic carbon price, especially the tension point that Kaveh mentioned and Yang mentioned is whether we will do a domestic carbon price. I think that would be a really interesting thing. If you have more time, I think it would be interesting to ask the respondents what's their preference among different policy tools, as in climate policy, tax credits, or carbon emissions, and what do they think the different alternative policy tools distributional impact is. I think that would be fascinating.
Yang, please.
I agree 1,000 times with the questions that my co-panelists raised, but I was wondering if two additional questions might be raised perhaps for consideration. I think the current polling makes very clear that people agree that there will be climate dividends to a carbon border adjustment mechanism. I wonder if people will also agree that the general public agrees that there are also occupational job increase dividends, and also if there are public health dividends to having a climate border adjustment mechanism in the United States. I think those two additional elements will also further the policy conversation in the United States, alongside complementing what Xuting mentioned with regards to a domestic carbon fee. So I think that'll be very important for us to have, and I'll be very keen on extrapolating those informations with the existing polling data as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you for that. Chris, I'm going to summarize two quick questions from the chat, and then ask you in our remaining few moments to respond. Really overlaps a good deal with what Shooting says, but I just want to put it into the record. Would it be worth examining whether there is popular support for a border carbon fee only approach versus one that pairs it with domestic policies to reduce emissions? And finally, what are the real chances that such a policy could be advanced in the next presidential election in Congress? I guess with the latter one, I'm asking you to think about the broader political context wearing that hat. Any thoughts there in reaction before we wind things down?
I could only agree with Shu-Ting in terms of that type of frame. That frame, as you can guess, is a little bit more complex to structure, but I think attainable as we move forward and looking at how we would pair that. So the answer is yes, and I'd love to do that next iteration. So I might be reaching out to run some sample frames by you to see what we could do. I think it's essential, right? Of course, Barry. I wish I could answer easily the other question about the likelihood or the convergence of the opinion with the political moment. I am struck. I'm very much struck as someone that's studied public and climate policy and climate opinion for a long time about the moment that we're in, right? The moment that we see with the convergence of public support. The idea that you have two major party candidates talking about tariffs, Democrat and Republican, at this moment right now is totally different, right? Folks that know American politics, it just doesn't happen. How they got there, the impact. There's such vibrant debate on the effects of those things. But the idea that this might be a mechanism that aligns differing viewpoints, differing saliency of various matters in one place, I think is really promising. And so, of course, the election outcomes will dictate exactly what doors open, maybe what doors close. But I think no matter what the results are in November, there's a possibility here that I don't think has existed as positively in a bit in American climate policy. That's my best answer.
Fair enough. And if I might just add one last piece, mindful of some of the work that you've done, even we've collaborated in the past. One of the things we really haven't been able to get to today is if you do begin to assess border adjustment fee, how to use that money, and politically, not economically, how you would allocate that in an optimal system, but politically, does that make a difference? And here, particularly in the European Union, we've seen a great survey research on that issue. But even the US, from what you've said historically, so there is some movement on numbers on a carbon tax or something like it, depending on how that revenue is allocated, all things to weigh and consider going forward. We clearly could go well into the afternoon, into the evening, at least up till debate time, but we need to wind things down. And so I would just like to turn to my friend and colleague, Tom Stokes, the other co-director of the Pricing Carbon Initiative, for some final comment, but thank all of you for your really thoughtful and constructive engagement. Tom.
What a great note to end on, Chris and Barry. This has just been a remarkably timely moment, as you describe it, Chris, and we can't thank you enough. So also particularly want to thank Kaveh, Yang, and Shu-Ting for your insightful comments. This is really, as I say, at this moment, it's been hard for us to really know, with so much unknown and such polarization politically, what we can really engage people in, and just the very idea that we're at this moment we're seeing some striking consensus across demographic and political spectrums and ideological and geographical and what have you is just, as Danny has said, it's eye-popping. And so we're very grateful for this and looking forward to seeing you soon. We're going to be having more programs as things unfold on the political spectrum and as we get reports from COP29. And so I really want to just thank everybody for making this such a timely and important discussion, I think. And I'd also like to thank our funders who have made this possible, the Alex C. Walker Foundation, the Felix Foundation, and Roger Sant, who have really enabled us to keep these programs going. So again, many thanks to all of you. Stay posted. We have more timely, exciting programs coming up in the fall, and be well.